It's Sabbath, it's communion service, and it's Remembrance Day. You know, I was thinking about today, this week, and as I was thinking about this week, I got wondering, I wonder how many times in my lifetime November 11 has fallen on a Saturday Sabbath. So I checked it out. And here's what I found out. I found out that this is the 8th Sabbath Remembrance Day that I have ever experienced. Richard has probably experienced 12 or something like that. I don't know. Maybe more. But the 8th one, and it was kind of interesting to me. In fact, I found out that Remembrance Day fell on a Sabbath the year I was born, the year I was baptized, and the year that I was married and began pastoral ministry. I thought that was kind of interesting. Maybe there's something good about these November 11 Sabbaths. And then I got wondering, I wonder if I've ever celebrated the communion service on Remembrance Day before. Have you ever thought about that? Have you? And that, of course, launched me into a little escapade down memory lane, so fasten your seatbelt and journey with me, as I'm going to review for you, whether you want it or not, my Remembrance Day Sabbaths. All right, ready? Doesn't matter, we're going ahead anyways. 1967, this is the year that I was born. And of course, even if I had been around for a communion service that November 11, I wouldn't remember it because I wasn't even quite 8 months old yet. But for the sake of thorough research, I did check this out. I asked my dad if he remembers whether or not he conducted a communion service at church on November 11, 1967. That's a reasonable question. Apparently, for some reason, he doesn't specifically recall whether or not he did or did not. Some people just need to keep better records. All right, moving on. Next one for me was 1972. We were living in Berrien Springs, Michigan. My father was completing the final year of his Master Divinity degree at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary. I was 5 years old. I have no idea where we attended church that day, nor do I have any idea if there happened to be a communion service. So I have nothing to say about 1972. Next, 1978. I also, like Richard Kruger, was baptized when I was 11. I was baptized that summer. So depending on when Kendallwood Church in Whitby scheduled their communion services, the communion service that final quarter of 1978, that might have been the first one, maybe the second one, depending when in the quarter it was. It might have been the first or the second one that I ever participated in actively as a newly baptized member, full-fledged member of the church. But whether it was on November 11 or not, I have no way of knowing. I think it was maybe Pastor Fraser was our pastor there. He was your pastor here, for those of you that were here a long time. He was my pastor at one point too. All right, 1989. This was the year that I, at the age of 22, graduated from university, got married, and began ministry. But not quite in that order. I actually began ministry a few weeks before I got married. And I am very close to 100% certain that we did not have a communion service that year on November 11. First of all, I'm pretty sure I would remember if we did, because I kind of do like keeping records. But secondly, it was about that time that the conference evangelist was conducting a series of evangelistic meetings in Prince Albert, where Sandra and I were living. I was the pastor of the Prince Albert, Saskatchewan district. So I don't think we would have done a communion service right in the middle of those evangelistic meetings. So I'm really certain we didn't do it in 1989. I only have a few left. 1995. Doesn't really matter how old I was. You can figure it out if you care. Did we celebrate communion that Sabbath? Nope. I preached at Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, the church where we lived. We didn't live in the church, we lived in Moose Jaw. But it felt sometimes like we lived in the church. And that Sabbath was the beginning of the North American Division Week of Prayer. So I know that my sermon that day was based on the theme that had been chosen for the Week of Prayer that day. It was not communion, so it didn't happen in 1995. 2000, what a crazy time that was for us. In fact, neither Sandra nor I even went to church that Sabbath. Sandra didn't go because she had just started the week before her first round of chemotherapy. because that was following her surgery the month before for ovarian cancer. So she wasn't going to church right then. I was the pastor of the Saskatoon Central Church, but that Sabbath morning I went to the theater instead of going to church. That is, I went to Place Real Theater at the University of Saskatchewan. Why? I hope you're wondering. Because I was the coordinator for a citywide evangelistic series of meetings being conducted by Pastors Henry Firerobin and Sean Boonstra in connection with It Is Written Canada. And those first couple of Sabbaths of that series of meetings, we met at the venue where the meetings were being held. We didn't meet in our local churches. The whole city came together. So there was no communion service celebrated in Saskatoon that Sabbath, at least not in Adventist churches. 2006. This is the one that I remember very particularly, very clearly. I remember that November 11 Sabbath very clearly. That Sabbath I preached at one of my churches in Regina, Saskatchewan, the Spirit of Truth Community Church, and again, Sandra did not join me at church. Only Darren came with me at church. Oh, look at that, he woke up. So let me explain this. Now, it's not that Sandra just chooses not to come to church on November 11, but there was a reason for this. A few weeks before, after a couple of years of dealing with the insanity of the adoption process, after losing somewhere in at least $25,000 to fraudulent pregnant women, we decided to end our pursuit of adopting a second child. However, our adoption lawyers in California, when we told them about this, they convinced us to hang in there till our proposal contract expired, which was just a little bit longer. And we didn't really want to. We didn't think we should, but it was easier to just go along with them than to argue with them. And so we agreed, even though in our minds we were done. Had a few more weeks and we would just put that thing to rest and get on with life. And then unexpectedly, an option to adopt a child from a lady who was at this point not at the beginning but fairly late in her pregnancy there in California suddenly came up. And frankly, by this point we were pretty jaded and pretty skeptical. And we were like, really? We're kind of done with this. And then we thought, well, how much money can we really lose like in a month? So we agreed to send a few $100s down so that this lady could visit a doctor for some prenatal care, which she had not yet availed herself of. So on Thursday, November 9, we were quite surprised to get a call from our lawyers down in California telling us that this lady had used the money that we had sent down not to go visit the doctor, but to purchase some drugs and use those drugs. And because of that use, she was now in the hospital in early labor. And the baby was expected to be born quite shortly. And they said to us, according to the laws of the state of California, if we wanted a chance to even possibly adopt this baby, at least one of us had to be present at the Victorville, California hospital within 48 hours. Wow, what a day that was. What a wild day as we consulted with doctors and anyone we knew with medical expertise, and we were asking about the significance of APGAR scores and trying to understand the possible impact of different types of illicit drugs. So in the end, we scrambled. We booked Sandra a flight to Los Angeles, booked a rental car, booked accommodation in Victorville. Sandra flew out on Friday, got to Victorville late that night. The next morning, Saturday, November 11, I remember that day, she arrived at the hospital just safely inside that 48-hour window. So I remember Darren and I went to church. I preached, did my thing. We came back home, and then Sandra and I spent many, many hours on the phone throughout the rest of that day, very prayerfully agonizing over whether or not Sandra should allow herself to begin to bond with this little baby girl that she was left along with the nurses to take care of in the hospital. What should we do? So we finally decided to go ahead and proceed with pursuing her adoption, which meant I suddenly had a bunch of things to do because we weren't really planning on doing that. So there was a number of things I had to take care of before Darren and I could leave, but finally on Tuesday morning, I strapped little 3-year-old Darren in his car seat, you know, those full harness deals, and finally we could leave. And the boys were cruising in the Chrysler to California to meet the girls. Remember? Yeah, he's shaking his head at me, but I know he remembers. After driving 1,700 miles in 2 days, I didn't have a full harness. At about 12:30 a.m., I guess it was technically by now Thursday morning, we were able to lay eyes on our baby sister and baby daughter for the first time. And this past Thursday, we celebrated Lavelle's 11th birthday. I remember November 11, 2006. Which brings us to 2017. Today, Sabbath, November 11. And I'm going to tell you this, given the last couple of Sabbath remembrance days that I've had, I'm going to be very happy if today can just be a normal, nice, calm communion service Sabbath with nothing dramatic happening. I'll be happy if 10 years from now I can't even remember what happened today because nothing significant happened. That would be okay with me. I'm okay for a quiet Remembrance Day Sabbath. So I spent quite a bit of time, you might be thinking way too much time, reviewing my own personal experience. You've been very kind to listen. So what does that have to do with you? Well, I simply wanted to kind of highlight that process of the reality of remembrance. And maybe as I talk about remembering, maybe you were able to think about some of those years and perhaps remember. Because this process of remembering can be kind of a mixed bag, right? There are things that it is quite pleasant to remember, and then there are other things that it is frankly very uncomfortable to remember. And interestingly enough, depending on current circumstances and perspectives and outcomes, even remembering sad or difficult or stressful occasions or events can actually be a positive and meaningful experience. And of course, that idea is certainly very relevant to the major aspects of Remembrance Day and the communion service. Remembering tragic events gives us reason for profound thankfulness in the here and now. Ontario, our province here, is one of only 4 of the 13 Canadian provinces and territories which does not set aside Remembrance Day as an official holiday. Apparently, we here in Ontario prefer to have Boxing Day off instead, which is such an Ontario approach to life. Remembrance Day, though, whether it's a holiday or not, is a memorial day observed in Commonwealth of Nations member states, Commonwealth countries, of which Canada is one. It developed out of the practice of observing Armistice Day, which commemorated the agreement that ended the First World War on November 11, 1918 at 11 a.m. And so in Canada, a bill was passed by the federal government in 1931, which officially designated November 11 of each year as Remembrance Day. Before, it kind of used to move around within the week, but they said, let's do it November 11, every year, same day. And we'll call it Remembrance Day. Specifically, according to Veteran Affairs, it is a remembrance for the men and women who have served and continue to serve our country during times of war, conflict, and peace. And that means this is a day when it's appropriate and important for us to remember the more than 2 million Canadians who have served and continue to serve. We remember the tragic loss of life sacrificed to provide and preserve our freedom. That means that we remember things like the almost 3,600 Canadians who lost their lives and the 7,000 who were wounded at the Battle of Vimy Ridge in World War I. We remember things like the 9,200 Canadian soldiers killed or wounded at the Battle of Hill 70 in World War I. In fact, just yesterday, you may have heard or seen, yesterday marked the 100th anniversary of the end of the Battle of Passchendaele, which resulted in almost 16,000 Canadian soldiers who were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. It was declared a victory, but some of the people, I don't know if there's even any left, but some of the people who were there described it as more like a senseless loss of life. We remember the over 1,900 people who died and the over 9,000 others who were injured in the 1917 Halifax explosion. Remember the 916 Canadian servicemen killed and almost 2,000 taken prisoner at the Dieppe raid during World War II, the bloodiest single day of the entire war for Canadians. Remember the 18 Canadians killed, 35 wounded, 14 taken prisoner, holding Hill 355 during the Korean War. We remember the 158 Canadian Armed Forces members who lost their lives during the 12-year Afghanistan mission. And that list can go on and on and on and on. Frankly, we remember the almost countless servicemen and women and their families who have and still today continue to try to live with the long-term effects of loss and injury and post-traumatic stress. The No Stone Left Alone Memorial Foundation makes the sentiment very clear, I think, with these words. They have said, if we do not remember, their sacrifice is meaningless. So let's choose today to remember. Yeah, we're past 11 o'clock. Doesn't mean we can't still remember. You know, as I looked into it, I was surprised by how often the Bible speaks to the issue of remembrance, actually from quite a variety of different contexts and perspectives. In fact, sometimes it speaks about what should not, what will not be remembered. Take, for example, this story from Exodus 17, which Irene read for us during our scripture reading. In fact, if you've got a Bible with you, you can load it up to that chapter, Exodus chapter 17. Now, Amalek was a grandson of Esau. He was one of 14 leaders in the land of Edom. And so these Amalekites, or in many versions it just calls them Amalek, these Amalekites were the descendants of Amalek's tribe. They were a branch of the Edomite nation. So we've already heard the story. But notice what it says here in Exodus 17, verse 14. I thought this was kind of interesting. Exodus 17, verse 14. After the battle's done, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." God tells Moses that Israel is supposed to keep in remembrance that the remembrance of Amalek is going to be utterly wiped out. And now compare that. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 17. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 25, verse 17. This thing comes up again. Deuteronomy chapter 25. Moses is near the end of his days now. And it says, beginning in verse 17 of Deuteronomy 25, "Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you were coming out of Egypt, how he met you on the way and attacked your rear ranks, all the stragglers at your rear, when you were tired and weary, and he did not fear God. Therefore, it shall be, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies all around, in the land which the Lord your God has given you to possess as an inheritance, that you will blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." And then God says, "You shall not forget." It's kind of interesting. God is basically telling them to remember what they are not going to have to remember. In other words, remember what I've made it possible for you to forget. And so the people of Israel, they continued to battle with the Amalekites intermittently all during the next quite a few centuries. But finally, it's recorded in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, during the time of King Hezekiah, men who were of the sons of Simeon finally finish off the last of the Amalekites. Finish them off. And today you can still find plenty of the descendants of the Israelites around, right? I drove by a whole bunch of them coming to church this morning, walking to the synagogue. But when is the last time you heard of any Amalekites? Any of you meet an Amalekite on the way to church? I don't think so. In essence, the remembrance of them is gone. So that's one kind of remembrance. But of course, the Bible also speaks of the remembrance of things which should not be forgotten. And arguably one of the most important remembrances that has ever been instituted is described in Luke 22:19 with these words, familiar words. And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And that's why we still continue to celebrate this communion service here today, almost 2,000 years later, because of those words. And just like with Remembrance Day ceremonies and traditions, the ceremony and traditions of the communion service involve participating in actions. It's not just a head game. By taking part in these active memorials, what we are honoring and remembering is better demonstrated and thus better impressed upon our thinking. So the most common symbol of Remembrance Day is what? I wasn't expecting him to ask a question. Now I don't know what he was saying. Poppy. Whoever said it quietly, but I saw people pointing. The red poppy, right? We know about the poppy. The background to this springs from the famous poem written by Canadian physician, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae in Flanders Fields. And without getting into all of the details, an American university teacher from Georgia by the name of Mona Michaels read the poem and was very deeply moved by the poem. Following World War I, while teaching a class for disabled servicemen at the University of Georgia, she began crafting and selling silk poppy replicas to raise funds for her disabled students so they could help support their families. And then in 1921, the American Legion adopted the poppy as the official symbol of remembrance for war veterans. Meanwhile, across the ocean in Europe, there was a war widow from France named Anne Guerin who championed the poppy over there as well, selling handcrafted replicas to raise funds to rebuild her war-torn country. And then she came over here to Canada to promote the poppy symbol, and in 1921, the Royal Canadian Legion, just as in the States, also adopted the poppy as the official symbol of remembering war veterans. And the idea was that the brilliant red color became a symbol of the blood spilled by so many people in various wars over so many years. And likewise, Jesus left us, interestingly enough, a vibrant, colored symbol of the blood that he was about to shed in sacrifice for our salvation. Holding up the cup of pure grape juice from the Passover meal, he said, it's recorded in Luke 22, verse 20, he said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you." And so according to his own instructions, the bread and the juice, these symbols that we take today, these same symbols that we take in the communion service, are the official symbols of remembrance for Jesus Christ, according to him. Christians sometimes like to pick their own symbols, but these are ones given by Christ, so we should probably stick with them. Remembrance Day and the communion service are about remembering the enormous cost at which your freedom was secured. They're about honoring those who sacrificed their lives for your freedom, for your safety. Remembering is not always easy. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure it's often very difficult at Remembrance Day time for those people who have lost loved ones, for those who have suffered, those who continue to suffer the results and the consequences of injury to body and to mind and to emotion. I imagine it's not easy to remember, but it's still nevertheless very important to remember. And likewise, it's not particularly nice to reflect upon the cruel treatment and torture that our Lord innocently and willingly endured because of our sin. It's not really nice, the story of the crucifixion, but it's still important for us to remember. Because human war has separated so many families, it's cut short so many lives, and likewise sin and death have caused painful separation between humanity and God. cutting short lives that were originally meant to be eternal lives. What a horrific toll. But thank God, this story that we remember has a happy ending. This story ends in victory. And that's why in the end, not in any way whatsoever to slight what it is that we honor and respect on Remembrance Day, I'm still going to say that the supremely most important remembrance that we can ever participate in is the remembrance of Jesus Christ and his sacrifice of saving love. His triumph over victory over death, over the enemy, is the only thing that will ultimately bring peace. We can fight till the end of our days, but only Christ can bring peace. As it says in Psalm 102, verse 12, "But you, O Lord, shall endure forever, and the remembrance of your name to all generations." I think it's worth noting that our remembrance in the communion service includes, interestingly enough, that element of eliminated remembrance. What do I mean by that? Remembering Christ and his sacrifice affirms that we will one day be able to forget Satan. Like the evil Amalekites who caused Israel so much trouble and pain, the time will come when the source of all evil, a miserable old devil, will no longer be a factor worth giving any thought, attention, or memory to. Psalm 34:16 says, "The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth." And I believe that the greatest realization of that will be on the new earth when the remembrance of Satan will be finished. So this communion remembrance includes the hope that looks forward to the time when we will no longer ever have to remember what sin was like. Don't you look forward to that time? I don't know what it's like to not know or not ever think about sin. Communion commemorates Christ's victory that ensures us that the remembrance of Satan will be utterly and permanently deleted. On my computer, I rarely do delete. I always do shift delete. If I'm getting rid of it, I'm getting rid of it. Permanent delete. There's going to be a permanent delete for Satan. Thank God. How cool, how amazing it is that in remembering God, we're putting ourselves in a position to eventually be able to forget Satan and sin. We remember so that one day we'll be able to forget. And so Jesus said, participate in this communion. Take these symbols in remembrance of me. So lest we forget, I invite you to join actively. Choose to participate in this communion service today.